Don't make me bury a fourth neighbor. Samuel Higgins had already found 3 homesteaders frozen solid in their cabins. Now he watched Elias Gunnarsson dig a tunnel through frozen ground 60 feet from barn to cabin and saw a fourth grave being dug. Every settler within 20 miles agreed. The Norwegian was crazy. He had 4 cows, half a cord of wood, and $47. You needed 10 cords to survive a Montana winter. The math said he would die. But on February 9th, 1887, 47 below zero, wind at 50 miles an hour, Higgins carried his dying daughter through that door. Gunnarsson's cabin held at 52 degrees. No fire burning. Every single skeptic was wrong. Here is how. The wind hit 50 miles an hour sometime after midnight. By dawn on February 9th, 1887, the temperature in eastern Montana had dropped to 47 degrees below zero. Inside his cabin, Elias Gunnarsson heard the knock. He crossed the room in 3 strides, opened the door, and caught Samuel Higgins as the man collapsed forward. Higgins clutched a bundle against his chest, his 7-year-old daughter Sarah, wrapped in every blanket he owned, her small body shaking with fever. "Woodpile's gone," Higgins gasped. His beard was frozen solid. Ice crusted his eyelashes. "Cabin dropped to 28 degrees. She's got pneumonia. She'll die if I don't." He stopped, stared. The cabin was warm. Not fire warm. There was no blaze in the stove, just a small cooking flame, but warm. 52 degrees, the wall thermometer read. Higgins's own cabin sat at 28, and this man had heat to spare. "How?" Higgins demanded. Gunnarsson pointed at the floor. Through the gaps in the planking, warm air rose in visible currents. 4 cows, he said. 60 feet of tunnel. Across the territory that night, the big die-up was killing cattle by the thousands. Ranchers who had bragged of their herds in October would find 90% of their stock frozen in gullies by spring. 2 homesteading families within 20 miles of where Higgins stood would be discovered dead in their cabins when the thaw came, bodies frozen where they'd huddled for warmth that never arrived. But Sarah Higgins would live, because 8 months earlier, a penniless Norwegian immigrant had dug a tunnel that every neighbor swore was madness. This is how it happened. September of 1886. Elias Gunnarsson stood at the land office window in Miles City, Montana Territory, and counted out $18 in worn bills. The clerk stamped his papers, slid them across, and didn't look up. 160 acres, Section 14, Township 47. 5 years continuous residence, then it's yours. Gunnarsson folded the deed into his coat. Outside, tied to a rail, stood 1 horse and 4 dairy cattle, 3 heifers, and a bull calf he'd bought for $32 from a settler fleeing the territory. The man had been eager to sell. Eager. "Winter's coming," the seller had said. "You don't want to be here for it." Gunnarsson had $47 remaining. He needed seed money for spring planting, tools, food stores. He had a rifle, a bedroll, a set of hand tools that had traveled with him from Trondheim. He had no wagon, no lumber, no coal, and he had 6 weeks until the first hard freeze. The ride to his claim took 3 days, 80 miles of rolling prairie, the grass already browning with autumn. He passed 2 abandoned homesteads. On the way, sod roofs collapsed, doors hanging open. No one had bothered to salvage the lumber. His own claim sat in a shallow valley carved by a tributary of Flat Willow Creek. 160 acres of grass, a single stand of cottonwood trees hugging the water, and the half-built skeleton of a sod barn that some previous claimant had started and never finished. Gunnarsson counted the cottonwoods, 8 mature trees, perhaps 20 saplings too thin for building. trees. To build a cabin, he would need every one of them. To heat that cabin through a Montana winter, he would need 10 cords of firewood minimum, the equivalent of 80 more trees, none of which existed within 15 miles. The math was simple. The math was impossible. He started building anyway. The cabin went up in 3 weeks. 14 feet by 16, logs chinked with river mud and prairie grass. Gunnarsson built it the way his father had taught him in Norway-raised floor on log piers, 18 inches of crawl space beneath the planking, the Scandinavian way. It kept the floor dry, kept the cold ground from stealing heat through direct contact, but keeping heat required having heat, and Gunnarsson had nothing to burn. He finished the roof on the 2nd day of October, using salvage boards from the abandoned sod barn and layers of cut sod. It would hold through the winter if the snows weren't too heavy. If they were, the roof would cave, and the roof would be the least of his problems. 3 days later, Samuel Higgins rode up. Higgins had been in Montana since '79, survived 7 winters, buried 3 neighbors who hadn't. He sat his horse and studied Gunnarsson's claim with the look of a man inspecting a grave. "You the Norwegian who filed on Section 14? "I am." "You know what you've got for a wood pile?" Gunnarsson glanced at the pile beside his cabin, the branches he'd trimmed from the cottonwoods during construction, plus deadfall he'd gathered from the creek bed. Maybe half a cord, loosely stacked. "That's what I thought." Higgins swung down from his saddle. He was 52 years old, lean and weathered, with eyes that had seen too many things he couldn't unsee. "Let me explain something, since nobody else will bother. You need 10 cords minimum to survive a Montana winter. 12 to be safe. A cord is 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet of split, stacked wood. 10 cords is more wood than that little stand of cottonwoods would give you if you cut every tree and burned the stumps." "I know what a cord is." "Then you know you're short by about 9.5 of them." Higgins walked to the woodpile, kicked it with his boot. "This here is 3 weeks of heat, maybe 4 if you freeze in the dark. After that you burn twisted hay. After that you burn your furniture. After that—" He turned back to Gunnarsson. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand. There's no timber within 15 miles. Nearest you can buy cut wood is Roundup, and they're charging $12 a cord this year, $15 if you want it delivered. You got $150 to spare?" Gunnarsson had 47. He said nothing. "I've buried 3 neighbors," Higgins said. His voice had gone flat, matter of fact. "The Hendersons in '82, the Paulson boy in '84. Old Mrs. Craddock last winter. She made it to February, then ran out of fuel during a 3-day blow, froze sitting in her rocking chair. We found her in the spring looking like she'd just fallen asleep, except she was frozen solid as a side of beef. The wind picked up, carrying the first bite of real cold. Gunnarsson felt it on his face, in his bones. "You seem like a decent sort," Higgins said. "Got 4 good cattle there, worth something. My advice? Sell them now. Take whatever you can get. Buy a train ticket back to wherever you came from. This country kills people who don't prepare, and you're about 9 cords short of prepared." He mounted his horse. "If you're still here come November, I'll check on you when I can, but I've got my own family to worry about." He gathered his reins. "Don't make me bury a 4th neighbor." He rode away without looking back. That night, Gunnarsson sat in his cabin and did the mathematics one more time. Half a cord of wood, 3 weeks of heat, maybe 4. Twisted hay he could gather enough to supplement, perhaps add another 2 weeks. But hay burned fast, hot, and brief. It required constant feeding. He would have to wake every hour through the night just to keep the fire alive. Buffalo chips were mostly gone, already collected by settlers who had been here longer. The few he could gather might give him another week, 6 weeks of fuel, 7 at most. Montana winters ran from November through April, 6 months, 24 weeks. He was short by 17 weeks of heat. Outside, the cattle lowed in the barn. He had finished the walls that afternoon, using the framework the previous owner had abandoned. A sod roof, dirt floor, enough space for 4 animals and their hay. The cattle were his investment, his entire investment, aside from the claim itself. In spring, he could sell the bull calf, breed the heifers, start building a herd. In 5 years, he could prove up his claim and own this land outright. In 5 years. First, he had to survive the next 5 months. He thought about Higgins's offer. Sell the cattle, buy a train ticket, go back east, find work in a factory, try again someday. But the cattle had cost him $32. The filing fee had cost $18. The supplies he'd purchased in Miles City had cost most of what remained. If he sold now, at distressed prices, he might get $40 for everything. Cattle, claim, tools combined. $40 would not get him home to Norway. $40 would not repay his family for the money they'd sent to fund his passage to America. $40 would make him exactly what Higgins expected. Another European fool who didn't listen, another name carved into the prairie, another abandoned homestead for someone else to find. He looked at the cabin walls, solid cottonwood logs, gaps chinked tight. He looked at the raised floor, the 18-inch crawl space beneath. The crawl space. He thought about his grandfather's farm in Trondheim, the old Fjøs, the combined farmhouse and barn where his grandfather had lived until he died at 87. Animals on the ground floor, family above. The heat rising through the floorboards on winter nights. The cattle are the fire, his grandfather used to say. You don't need to burn wood when you have living wood that makes its own heat. Gunnarsson stood up. He walked outside into the cold October darkness and crossed to the barn. Inside, the 4 cattle turned to watch him, their breath steaming in the lamplight. He held his hand out toward the nearest heifer. Warm, radiating heat like a cast-iron stove. He had read somewhere in a farming journal on the ship from Norway, or perhaps in a pamphlet from the Agricultural Society, that a single cow produced 3,500 British thermal units per hour. 4 cows would produce 14,000. A good wood stove put out 10 to 20,000. 4 cows equaled 1 stove, running day and night, burning nothing but hay. He already had the hay. He'd been cutting it for weeks, stockpiling it for winter feed. The cattle needed it to survive. But if the cattle could survive, the cattle could heat. The question was how to move that heat from barn to cabin. He walked back outside, stood between the 2 buildings. 60 feet of frozen prairie separated them. Underground, the earth held stable temperatures. He knew this from root cellars, from the stories his grandmother told about the ancient Romans and their hippocaust floors. 5 feet down, the ground stayed above freezing even when the surface dropped to 40 below. If he dug a tunnel, 5 feet deep, 60 feet long, opening into the barn at floor level, where the warm air from the cattle accumulated, rising into his cabin's crawl space, where the heat could spread beneath the floor and radiate upward. The cattle would be the furnace. The tunnel would be the duct. The cabin would stay warm. Maybe. If the tunnel didn't collapse, if the ground didn't freeze solid before he could finish, if 4 cattle really produced enough heat, if the moisture from the barn didn't rot his floor timbers, if. But the alternative was certain death, and a certain death required no imagination at all. 3 days later, Gunnarsson rode 40 miles to Roundup. The town consisted of a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and 12 houses arranged along a single muddy street. Anna Lindqvist ran the general store, a Swedish widow who had outlasted her husband by 6 years, and the Montana winters by her own stubborn refusal to leave. She watched Gunnarsson pile his purchases on her counter. Rope, a second shovel, nails, burlap sacking. "Digging in November?" she asked. "Ground's already getting hard. It will be harder next week." "What are you digging?" "Well's in the wrong place for that much rope," he explained. "The tunnel, the cattle, the heat transfer." She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, she shook her head slowly. "I've heard of the Norwegian barns," she said. "My grandmother had one in the old country. 30 head of cattle underneath, family on top. But they weren't pumping warm air through 60 feet of frozen dirt. The dirt won't be frozen 5 feet down." "And the moisture?" She leaned forward on the counter. "Cow breath is wet, Mr. Gunnarsson. Warm and wet. You pump that into your crawl space, you'll rot every timber under your floor. 2 years from now, maybe sooner, your cabin will collapse into a pile of moldy splinters. I'll vent the crawl space, a small hole in the roof." "Vent it how?" "Open enough to let moisture out. You let heat out. Close it enough to keep heat in. The moisture stays." She began tallying his purchases, writing figures on a scrap of paper. 4 cows isn't 30 either. You'd need 20 head minimum to heat a cabin through a real Montana winter. And even if it worked, which it won't, you're talking about 2 weeks of digging instead of 2 weeks of gathering fuel. When your tunnel fails, you'll have nothing to fall back on. "My tunnel won't fail. The smart man buys hay and burns it like everyone else." "I need the hay to feed the cattle." "Then you've got a problem, don't you?" She slid the bill across to him. $4.12. "You want advice with that?" He counted out the money. "Go home," she said, not unkindly. "Sell those cattle while you can still get a price for them. This isn't a country for clever ideas. This is a country for people with enough wood to burn." He gathered his supplies and walked out. The first hard frost came that night. Gunnarsson rode home through air that crackled with cold, ice forming on his horse's mane, his breath leaving a trail of crystals behind him. By the time he reached his claim, the stars were hard as diamonds and the temperature had dropped below 0. In the morning, he started digging. The first foot was easy, prairie topsoil, loose and dark, breaking apart under his shovel with minimal effort. The second foot was harder clay mixed with rock, requiring the pickaxe to loosen before the shovel could clear. By noon of the first day, he had excavated a trench 4 feet long and 3 feet deep. At this rate, 60 feet would take 2 weeks. He did not have 2 weeks. November 15th. Temperature, 12 degrees above 0. Tunnel progress, 18 feet completed. Gunnarsson had developed a rhythm. Wake before dawn, feed the cattle, eat a cold breakfast of hardtack and dried meat, dig until his arms shook and his back screamed. Break for 15 minutes, dig again, eat at midday without sitting down. Dig until dark, feed the cattle again, collapse into bed without undressing. His hands had blistered the first day. By the third day, the blisters had torn open. By the 5th, calluses were forming over raw flesh. His shoulders burned with a constant fire. He had lost weight. His trousers hung loose on his hips, cinched tight with a rope. 18 feet, 42 to go. November 18th, temperature 2 degrees, above 0. Tunnel progress, 24 feet. Jacob Reeves rode onto the claim just after noon. Gunnarsson had heard of Reeves, the cattle speculator who bought out failed homesteads at desperate prices. He had purchased 11 claims in 3 years, paying pennies on the dollar to settlers too broken to negotiate. The man had an eye for failure the way some men had an eye for gold. He found Gunnarsson chest deep in the trench, dirt piled in mounds around him. His horse picked its way carefully between the piles, and Reeves sat studying the scene with the expression of a man watching something amusing. Building your own grave? That's efficient. Save someone the trouble come spring. Gunnarsson kept digging. The pickaxe rose and fell. What is that, anyway? Wrong place for a well, wrong depth for a cellar. A tunnel. A tunnel to where? Gunnarsson nodded toward the barn without stopping his work. Reeves laughed. The sound was genuine, unforced. The laugh of a man who had just heard the funniest thing in months. You're going to live with the cattle. Can't say I'm surprised. Heard you foreigners like your animals. The tunnel carries warm air. The cattle heat my cabin. The laughter stopped. Reeves leaned forward in his saddle, squinting. Say that again. Gunnarsson straightened, resting the pickaxe against the trench wall. He was covered in dirt, his face streaked with sweat despite the freezing air, his breath coming hard. 4 cows produce 14,000 British thermal units per hour. That's equivalent to a cast iron stove. The tunnel carries the warm air from the barn to my cabin's crawl space. The heat rises through the floor. British thermal units. Reeves pronounced the words like they were a foreign language. That's Norwegian nonsense. Cattle don't make heat, not real heat. Stand next to one and tell me they don't make heat. Not enough heat, not to survive out here. Reeves's expression shifted, amusement giving way to calculation. Listen, friend, you seem like a decent sort, just ignorant. I've seen your type before, full of ideas, short on sense. Let me make you an offer, right here, today. $50 for your claim, your cattle, everything. That's more than fair. You take that 50, buy yourself a train ticket back east, find work in a factory, send for your people when you've got real money. The claim is worth more than 50. The claim is worth nothing if you're dead on it. Reeves's voice hardened. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to walk away with something instead of nothing. That tunnel isn't going to work. Everyone who sees it knows it isn't going to work. And when you freeze out, and you will freeze out, I'll be back. But by then, the offer will be $5, not 50. Because by then, you'll be begging me to take this place off your hands. He gathered his reins. Think about it. The offer stands until the first blizzard. After that, he shrugged. After that, we'll be discussing your estate. He rode off without looking back. Word spread. Within a week, every homesteader within 20 miles had heard about the Norwegian who was digging a tunnel from his barn to his cabin to heat it with cow breath. Some rode out to see for themselves. They stood at the edge of the trench, watching Gunnarsson work, shaking their heads. A few offered advice: dig faster, dig shallower, give up. None offered to help. That's what happens when you let just anyone file a claim, one man said, loud enough to be heard. Man's touched in the head. Probably be dead by Christmas. Higgins came by once, stood at a distance, watching, did not dismount. You could still sell the cattle, he called out. There's time. Barely. Gunnarsson kept digging. Higgins rode away. The Christmas gathering at Roundup, the one time each year when homesteaders from 100 miles around came together, would be held in 3 weeks. Gunnarsson had not received an invitation. He learned later that his name had been mentioned at the planning meeting. No point inviting a dead man, someone had said. Bad luck. November 20th. Temperature, 8 degrees above zero. Tunnel progress, 24 feet. Ground temperature at 5 feet, 38 degrees. Still workable, 40% complete. Gunnarsson calculated. At his current pace, 3 feet per day on good soil, 2 feet per day on clay, he needed 12 more days to finish. The last weather he'd heard from passing riders suggested clear skies for another week, maybe 10 days. Then the first big blizzard would blow in from Canada, and everything on the surface would freeze solid. He had perhaps 10 days. He needed 12. November 22nd, temperature 3 degrees below zero. Tunnel progress 30 feet. November 23rd, temperature 5 degrees below zero. Tunnel progress 36 feet. The ground was changing, harder, more clay, less loam. Each strike of the pickaxe sent shock waves up his arms and into his shoulders. His back had stopped hurting 3 days ago, which worried him. Numbness was worse than pain. At midday, young Thomas Higgins appeared on horseback. 14 years old, his father's eyes in a boy's face. "Pa sent me," the boy said. "He says there's a blizzard coming, big one, 2 days, maybe less." Gunnarsson looked at the sky. Clear blue, not a cloud visible, but the air had that quality he remembered from Norway, that stillness before everything changed. "Thank you. Tell your father I appreciate the warning." The boy lingered, stared at the trench, now 36 feet long, disappearing into the earth at a slight downward angle toward the barn. "Is it true, what they say? That you're going to heat your cabin with cows?" "That's the plan. Does it work?" "I'll know in 2 days." The boy rode off. Gunnarsson turned back to the trench. 24 feet to go, 2 days to dig them. November 24th, temperature 18 degrees below zero. Tunnel progress 42 feet. He had worked through the night, no sleep. The lantern burning, shadows dancing on the earthen walls. The pickaxe rising and falling in a rhythm that had become automatic, thoughtless, mechanical. 6 feet in 18 hours. His body was failing. He could feel it in the tremor of his hands, the spots that swam at the edges of his vision, the way he had to pause after every 10th swing just to remember how to breathe. He had eaten nothing since yesterday morning, no time, no energy to cook. Water from the creek, scooped up in cupped hands, ice forming on his beard before he could swallow. The sky had changed overnight, gray now with that flat metallic quality that meant snow. The wind had started just after dawn, a steady push from the northwest that cut through his coat like it wasn't there. 18 feet to go. He kept digging. November 25th, 8 in the morning. Temperature 23 degrees below zero. Wind building. Sky heavy gray. Tunnel progress 48 feet. The storm hit at 10. One moment, clear visibility across the prairie. The next, a wall of white advancing from the north like a living thing, swallowing the horizon, the distant hills. Higgins's cabin 3 miles away. The wind went from 20 miles an hour to 50 in the space of 10 minutes. Snow began falling, not falling, driving horizontal, stinging, blinding. Gunnarsson climbed out of the trench. The barn was visible only as a dark shape through the swirling white. His cabin, 60 feet in the other direction, had vanished entirely, 12 feet unfinished. He could not dig in this. The trench would fill with snow faster than he could clear it. The wind would bury him, and the temperature was still dropping. He could feel it, 25 below and falling, 30 below before nightfall. He had failed, or maybe he scrambled down into the trench again, fighting through the snow already accumulating. Crawled forward through the tunnel, 48 feet of darkness, earthen walls close on either side, the ceiling 4 feet above him. The ground was warmer here. Not warm, but warmer than the surface. The tunnel's depth protected it from the wind, from the worst of the cold. He emerged into the barn. The cattle turned to look at him, unbothered by the howling outside. The building shook with each gust, but the walls held. And the temperature inside? He held his hand out toward the nearest heifer. Heat radiated from her body, warming his frozen fingers. 42 degrees, maybe 45. The animals generated a constant warmth that filled the enclosed space. He looked at the tunnel opening. Warm air was moving. He could feel it. A gentle flow from the barn into the passage, rising toward the cabin's crawl space. The system was working, but only 48 feet of tunnel, not 60. Would it be enough? He crawled back through the passage. Emerged in his cabin's crawl space, the 18-inch gap beneath his floor. Cold here. Bitterly cold. 31 degrees on the thermometer he'd hung from the joists. He opened the wooden damper fully, the one he'd built to control airflow from the tunnel. Waited. 31 degrees. 1 hour. 34 degrees, 2 hours, 37 degrees, 3 hours, 40 degrees. By nightfall, with the blizzard screaming overhead and the temperature outside dropping toward 35 below, the cabin interior held at 41 degrees. Not warm, but survivable. The incomplete tunnel, carrying heat from 4 cows through 48 feet of frozen earth, was keeping him alive. November 26th, the second day of the blizzard. Temperature outside, 32 degrees below zero. Temperature inside, 43 degrees. A knock at the door. Gunnarsson opened it to find young Thomas Higgins collapsed on his doorstep, a rope tied around his waist trailing back into the white void. The boy had roped his way from his father's cabin, half a mile distant, following the line hand over hand through the storm. "Pa sent me," the boy gasped through frozen lips, "to check if you're alive." Gunnarsson pulled him inside, stripped off his ice-crusted coat, pressed a cup of hot coffee into his shaking hands. The boy's eyes went wide. "It's warm in here. 43 degrees. The tunnel? The cows? 48 feet. Enough." Thomas Higgins sat by the crawl space vent, warm air rising around him, thawing his frozen face. He stared at the floor like it was performing a miracle. "Pa said you were crazy," he said quietly. "Everyone said you were crazy." "Maybe I was." "This isn't crazy." The boy looked up at Gunnarsson. This is something else." The blizzard broke on November 28th. Temperature, 15 degrees below zero. Clear sky. Still air. The tunnel had kept the working face from freezing solid. The earth at 48 feet, insulated by 4 feet of soil above. It, and warmed by the constant flow of air from the barn, remained soft enough to dig. Gunnarsson finished the final 12 feet in 2 days. 60 feet of tunnel, 3 feet wide, 4 feet tall, connecting barn to cabin, cattle heat to human survival. The system worked. But the real winter hadn't arrived yet. December brought moderate cold 20 below, 25 below, nothing the tunnel couldn't handle. The cabin held steady at 45 to 50 degrees. The cattle stayed healthy, eating their hay, producing their heat. Gunnarsson fell into a routine: wake, feed, check tunnel, cook, wait. Higgins rode over after Christmas, stood in the cabin doorway, feeling the warmth, saying nothing for a long moment. "It's working," he finally admitted, "so far. December's not January." Higgins's voice held no triumph, no apology, just the flat statement of a man who had seen too much. Wait until the deep cold. Wait until the blizzards stack up one after another. Then we'll see. The cattle produce constant heat. The tunnel maintains stable temperature. January won't change the physics. Physics? Higgins shook his head. "I've buried neighbors who believed in physics. The cold doesn't care about your theories." He left without saying goodbye. Reeves rode past a few days later. Didn't stop, didn't dismount, Just slowed his horse enough to call out, "Still alive? Impressive. Most fools freeze out before Christmas." He smiled, showing teeth. "But January's coming. I'll have the paperwork ready." He rode on. December 28th, temperature 35 below, falling. December 29th, temperature 40 below. December 30th, temperature 38 below. December 31st, temperature dropping again. Weather signs pointing to something worse than anyone had seen. Gunnarsson checked his supplies, hay for the cattle, maybe 60% of what he'd want for a normal winter. But this wasn't a normal winter. The cold was burning through their reserves faster than expected. Food for himself: beans, flour, salt pork, coffee. Spartan, but survivable. Wood for cooking: 2 cords. Enough, if he was careful. Backup heating if the tunnel failed. Nothing. No alternative. No second chance. On January 1st, 1887, the temperature in eastern Montana reached 41 degrees below zero. By January 12th, it would fall to 53 below. The blizzards would start on January 15th and continue with only brief breaks through early March. They would kill 362,000 cattle across the territory. They would freeze settlers in their cabins, ranchers in their saddles, cowboys in the draws where they'd sought shelter from winds that reached 60 miles an hour. They would test Elias Gunnarsson's tunnel in ways he had never imagined. And somewhere in those frozen weeks, a 7-year-old girl with pneumonia would arrive at his door, and everything would depend on whether 4 cows and 60 feet of dirt could save her life. The real test was coming. January of 1887 arrived like a door slamming shut. The first week brought temperatures that made December seem mild: 41 below on the 1st, 44 below on the 3rd, a brief rise to 30 below on the 5th. Settlers called it a warm spell, and some actually believed it. Inside Gunnarsson's cabin, the thermometer held steady. 46 degrees, 48, 45 on the coldest nights. The tunnel performed exactly as designed, carrying warm air from the barn in a constant, invisible river. The floor radiated heat upward. The walls stayed dry. The cattle, visible through the gaps in the floorboards if he pressed his eye close enough, moved and breathed and lived. He fell into the rhythm of survival. Wake before dawn. Descend into the crawl space to check the tunnel. No ice buildup, no blockages, airflow steady. Climb out. Cross to the barn through whatever weather the sky had delivered overnight. Feed the cattle. Check their water. Measure their hay consumption against his dwindling supply. The hay worried him. 4 cattle needed 30 pounds each per day, 120 pounds total. He had started the winter with roughly 3,000 pounds, enough for 25 days at full rations. But the cold was deeper than expected, lasting longer than expected. The cattle were eating more, burning fuel to maintain their body heat. By January 8th, he had used 40% of his hay supply. At this rate, he would run out by late February. If the hay ran out, the cattle would starve. If the cattle starved, they would stop producing heat. If they stopped producing heat, the tunnel would carry nothing but cold air. If the tunnel carried cold air, he began rationing. 25 pounds per cow per day instead of 30. The cattle would lose weight, but they would live. Thinner cattle produce marginally less heat, but marginally less was not none. It was the only option. January 12th, temperature 53 degrees below zero. Gunnarsson had never experienced cold like this. In Norway, the winters had been harsh, but nothing approached 50 below. At this temperature, exposed skin froze in minutes. Spit crackled and turned to ice before it hit the ground. The air itself seemed to thicken, resisting movement, resisting breath. He made the walk from cabin to barn as fast as he could manage. 30 seconds of exposure, no more. The cattle huddled together in the center of the barn, their breath forming clouds that rose and pooled against the ceiling. They had lost weight on the reduced rations, their ribs beginning to show beneath their winter coats. But they were alive, still warm, still producing heat. The tunnel temperature had dropped slightly, 38 degrees instead of the usual 42. The thinner cattle were generating marginally less output, but 38 degrees was still above freezing, still enough to keep the cabin at 44, 45 degrees. Survivable, barely. Across the territory, the world was dying. Gunnarsson heard the news from passing riders when the weather broke enough for travel, which wasn't often. Cattle were freezing on the open range by the thousands standing in draws, seeking shelter from the wind and simply stopping. Their bodies would be found in the spring, preserved by the cold, stacked in gullies like cordwood. The big ranchers were ruined. Men who had boasted of 10,000 head in October would count their survivors in the hundreds by March. The open-range cattle industry, which had transformed Montana from wilderness to wealth in a single decade, was ending in a single winter. Homesteaders fared little better. 2 families within 15 miles of Gunnarsson's claim had stopped sending smoke from their chimneys. No one could reach them to check. No one would know their fate until spring. Reeves, the speculator, had lost 200 head of his own cattle he'd been holding on purchased claims, waiting for prices to rise. The loss wouldn't bankrupt him, but it would hurt. Some said he was already calculating which homesteads would fail, which widows would need to sell, which orphaned claims he could acquire for pennies. The winter was killing everything it touched, everything except 4 cows in a sod-roofed barn and 1 Norwegian in a cabin heated by their breath. January 15th. The blizzards began. Not a single storm, but a series waves of white rolling down from Canada, one after another, with barely a day's break between them. The wind never truly stopped. It would drop from 50 miles an hour to 20. Settlers would emerge blinking into the gray light, and then the next front would hit, and the world would vanish again. Gunnarsson stopped counting the days. Time became measured in hay consumption, in tunnel temperatures, in the slow thinning of his cattle. 30% of his hay remained, then 25, then 20. The cattle were visibly gaunt now. The bull calf, youngest and smallest, had begun to weaken. His heat output had dropped noticeably. Standing near him no longer felt like standing near a stove. It felt like standing near a cooling ember. If the bull calf died, he would lose a quarter of his heat supply. If he lost a quarter of his heat supply, the cabin temperature would drop. If the cabin temperature dropped, he increased the bull calf's ration. 30 pounds instead of 25. It meant the others got less, but the calf was the weakest link. Strengthen the weakest link, or watch the whole chain fail. January 27th. Hay supply, 18%. Tunnel temperature, 36 degrees. Cabin temperature, 42 degrees. The margins were narrowing. Every day brought the system closer to failure. Not dramatic failure, not collapse, not catastrophe, but the slow erosion of degrees. 42 today. 40 tomorrow. 38 the day after. At some point, the math would stop working. The cattle would produce too little heat. The tunnel would carry too little warmth. The cabin would drop below freezing and then below survival, and Gunnarsson would become another story settlers told about European fools who didn't listen. He had perhaps 3 weeks of hay remaining. The winter had perhaps 6 weeks remaining. He was still going to run out. January 28th, 1887, 6 in the morning. The wind began building before dawn. Gunnarsson felt it in his sleep, the cabin shuddering, the logs groaning against their chinking. He woke to darkness and the sound of a world trying to tear itself apart. By the time gray light filtered through the gaps in his shutters, the temperature outside had dropped to 38 below, and the wind had reached 50 miles an hour. He made his morning trip to the barn at a crawl, one hand on the guide rope he'd strung between buildings, the other shielding his face from snow that drove horizontal like needles. The cattle were pressed together in the corner, wild-eyed but alive. He forked hay to them, 25 pounds each, no more. He couldn't spare more, and checked the tunnel opening. Warm air still flowing, still working. He crawled back to the cabin. The storm would last, he estimated, 2 or 3 days. He had ridden out worse. He would ride out this. At 8 that evening, someone knocked on his door. The sound was so faint, he almost missed it. A thump against the wood, barely audible over the shrieking wind, then another, then a third, weaker than the first two. Gunnarsson crossed the cabin in 3 strides and pulled the door open against the gale. Samuel Higgins fell across the threshold. He was carrying someone wrapped in every blanket he owned, a small form, motionless, pressed against his chest. His beard was frozen solid, ice coating his eyebrows, his lips blue beneath the frost. "Sarah," he gasped. "Fever. 2 days. Woodpile's gone. Cabin's at 28 degrees and dropping." Gunnarsson pulled them inside, slammed the door against the wind. The bundle in Higgins's arms moved slightly, and a small face emerged from the blankets. A 7-year-old girl, her cheeks flushed red with fever, her breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. Pneumonia. He had seen it before, in Norway. The wet cough, the labored breathing, the fever that climbed and climbed until it either broke or killed. She needed warmth, constant warmth, warmth that wouldn't falter when the fire burned down, wouldn't fail when the woodpile ran out. She needed exactly what this cabin had. "Put her here," Gunnarsson said, clearing his cot, piling blankets, near the floor vent, the warmest spot. Higgins laid his daughter down like she was made of glass. His hands were shaking, not just from cold, from fear. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. "Mrs. Higgins and the other children are in our cabin. It's warmer than walking. But Sarah, she can't. The cold will. She's safe here." The tunnel. Higgins looked at the floor, at the warm air rising through the gaps in the planking. "The cattle. It's working, 42 degrees. Higgins made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "I said you were crazy." "You were probably right." "I said you'd be dead by Christmas." "Still here." Sarah coughed, a deep, wet, terrible sound that seemed to come from somewhere far inside her small body. Her fever was burning through the blankets. Gunnarsson pressed his hand to her forehead. 103 degrees, maybe 104. The crisis point for pneumonia was 105. Above that, the brain began to cook. Above that, children died. "We need to cool her," Gunnarsson said. "Slowly. Wet cloths, water from the barrel, not too cold." They worked through the night. Higgins held his daughter while Gunnarsson pressed damp cloths to her forehead, her wrists, the back of her neck. The fever climbed. 104, 104 and a half. The girl's breath came in rattling gasps, each exhale a struggle, each inhale worse. Outside, the blizzard screamed. The temperature dropped to 41 below, then 43, then 45. The cabin walls shook with every gust. Snow piled against the door until Gunnarsson had to shovel a path just to check that the exit wasn't completely buried. But inside, the floor stayed warm. 42 degrees in the crawl space, 44 in the cabin. The heat rose from below in a constant, invisible current, wrapping around the sick child like a living blanket. January 29th, the second day of the blizzard. Temperature outside 44 below. Temperature inside 43 degrees. Sarah's fever held at 104. She had stopped coughing as violently, which might have been a good sign or might have meant she was too weak to cough. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, each inhale a small fight against lungs filling with fluid. Higgins had not slept. He sat beside his daughter, holding her hand, whispering things Gunnarsson couldn't hear. Prayers, maybe. Promises. The desperate bargaining of a father watching his child slip away. "The heat," Higgins said at some point during the second night. "It's constant. My cabin, the stove, the fire goes up and down. Hot when you feed it, cold when it burns down. This is—" "The cattle don't stop," Gunnarsson said. "They breathe all night. They generate heat all night. The tunnel carries it all night." "You were right. Ask me if I was right after she lives." They waited. The blizzard raged. The floor stayed warm. January 30th, the third day. Temperature outside, 41 below. Temperature inside, 44 degrees. Midnight. Gunnarsson was dozing in his chair, exhaustion finally dragging him under, when Higgins's voice cut through the darkness. "It's dropping. The fever. It's dropping." He was at the cot in a heartbeat, his hand on Sarah's forehead, still hot, but different. The burning quality had faded. The sweat on her brow was cooling rather than evaporating instantly. 102 degrees. By dawn, 101. By noon, 100 even. The fever had broken. Sarah Higgins opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days. She looked at her father, then at the unfamiliar cabin, then at the stranger standing in the corner. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Safe," Higgins said. His voice cracked on the word. "We're safe." Outside, the blizzard finally began to weaken. But the winter wasn't finished. February brought another blizzard, and another, and another. The temperature dropped to 47 below on February 9th, the coldest night of the entire winter, the night that would kill more cattle across Montana than any other single night in recorded history. Gunnarsson's hay supply fell to 15%, then 12, then 10. The cattle were skeletal now, every rib visible, every hip bone jutting beneath their winter coats. They moved slowly, conserving energy, generating just enough heat to stay alive and keep the tunnel fed. The bull calf had rallied slightly after the increased rations, but he was still the weakest, still the one closest to giving out. Tunnel temperature, 36 degrees. Cabin temperature, 48 degrees. The extra warmth came from the extra bodies. Sarah, recovering slowly but steadily. Higgins, who had not returned to his own frozen cabin. 2 additional humans adding their heat to the system, their breath in their bodies raising the interior temperature even as the cattle's output declined. 4 cows and 2 men and 1 recovering child. Enough. Barely enough. But enough. February 10th. The blizzard broke. Gunnarsson stepped outside for the first time in 3 days. The cold hit him like a physical below 22 below, but after what they'd survived, it felt almost warm. The sky was clear, a pale winter blue, and the prairie stretched out in every direction as a single unbroken sheet of white. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from any visible horizon. No horses, no cattle, no signs of life anywhere. The world looked like it had been scrubbed clean and left to freeze. Higgins joined him. The older man stood silent for a long moment, scanning the emptiness. "My cabin's frozen solid," he said. "We checked yesterday when the wind dropped. Ice inside the walls. Everything we left behind is ruined." "The structure?" "Still standing, We'll rebuild, but if I'd stayed there with Sarah. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The other homesteads? Gunnarsson asked. Higgins shook his head slowly. The Andersons stopped sending smoke 2 weeks ago. The Mullers the week before that. Nobody's checked. Nobody could check. Gunnarsson thought about what they would find in the spring. Bodies frozen where they'd huddled for warmth. Families who had run out of fuel, run out of options, run out of time. We should check when we can, he said. We will. Higgins turned to face him. But first I need you to show me how to build one of these tunnels. The thaw came in late March. Slowly at first, a degree of warming each day, then 2, then 5. The snow began to melt, rivers of water running across the prairie, pooling in low spots, turning the roads to impassable mud. The sun, absent for so many months, returned with a vengeance, and settlers emerged from their cabins, blinking and squinting like creatures climbing out of caves. The counting began. Across Montana Territory, 362,000 cattle had died. Ranchers who had been wealthy in October were bankrupt by April. The open-range cattle industry, which had defined the territory for a decade, was effectively finished. Herds that had numbered in the tens of thousands were reduced to hundreds, to dozens, to none. The human toll was harder to count. Bodies were found throughout the spring in cabins, in draws, in places where people had tried to walk to safety and hadn't made it. 2 settler families within 20 miles of Gunnarsson's claim were discovered frozen in their homes. The Mullers had run out of wood in early February. The Andersons had made it until the end of January. 5 confirmed deaths within a day's ride of Gunnarsson's cabin, and inside that cabin, heated by 4 cows and 60 feet of tunnel, 4 people had survived, including a 7-year-old girl who would have died of pneumonia in any other structure for 30 miles in any direction. The visitors began arriving in April. First came Higgins's wife and children, finally able to make the journey from their frozen cabin. They stood in Gunnarsson's doorway, staring at the warm interior, the raised floor, the crawl space vents still carrying faint traces of warmth from the barn. Sam told us, Mrs. Higgins said. I didn't believe him. Nobody believed him, Gunnarsson replied. Nobody believed me either. Then came other homesteaders, 3 from the west, 2 from the east, 1 who had ridden 40 miles just to see if the stories were true. They walked through the tunnel on their hands and knees, emerging in the barn with expressions of wonder. They measured the dimensions. They asked questions about depth, about airflow, about moisture control. Gunnarsson answered everything. You could charge for this, one man said. Sell the plans, patent the design. It's not my design. It's how my grandfather stayed warm in Norway. It's how people have stayed warm for 1,000 years. I just remembered it at the right time. Word spread. By May, 15 families had committed to building tunnels or modified versions, connecting root cellars to existing barns, enlarging crawl spaces, adapting the principle to their specific circumstances. One rancher near Billings was planning a larger system. 20 cattle, 2 buildings, enough heat for a bunkhouse and a main residence. The Scandinavian Immigrant Society in Minneapolis requested a written account. Gunnarsson spent 3 evenings composing a letter. Tunnel dimensions, construction timeline, temperature records, fuel savings. The society published it in their quarterly newsletter. 50 copies circulated among Norwegian settlers across Dakota and Montana territories. It wasn't a revolution, it wasn't a transformation, but it was something. Anna Lindqvist rode out in late May. Gunnarsson saw her coming from half a mile away, the only figure moving across the greening prairie, her horse picking its way through the remnants of winter. He was working in his field by then, turning the soil for spring planting, and he stopped to watch her approach. She dismounted without greeting, walked to the cabin, looked at it for a long moment. "Show me," she said. He showed her the crawl space, the tunnel entrance, the barn with its 4 surviving, cattle thin but alive, already beginning to regain weight on the spring grass, the simple wooden damper that controlled airflow, the small roof vent that released excess moisture. She touched the floor planks. Solid, no rot, no mold. "I told you the moisture would destroy your timbers. You were being practical. I was being wrong." She straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands. 4 cows, 60 feet of tunnel. You heated this cabin all winter with 4 cows and 60 feet of tunnel. That's right. Wood consumption? 1.5 cords for cooking only. Standard cabin this size would have needed 10, 12 if they wanted to be comfortable. 11 families died within 50 miles of here because they ran out of fuel. 2 of them were closer to timber than I was. Anna was silent for a moment. Then, "I'll stock the design specifications in my store. Anyone who wants to build one, I'll provide materials at cost." "You don't have to." "Yes," she said. "I do." Reeves came in June. Gunnarsson was mending a fence when the speculator rode up, same horse, same calculating expression, same look of a man evaluating property rather than people. "Heard you made it through," Reeves said, not dismounting. "Heard you lost 200 head. Reeves's jaw tightened. "The weather." "The weather killed my neighbor's cattle, too. It didn't kill mine. 4 cows in a barn isn't ranching, it's—" He waved his hand vaguely. "It's farming, Norwegian farming. My 4 cows are alive, your 200 are dead." Reeves sat very still on his horse. His eyes moved from the cabin to the barn to the tunnel entrance, visible as a dark opening at ground level. "Lucky," he said finally. "One lucky winner. That's all this was. You're welcome to inspect the system. I'll explain how it works." "I don't need Norwegian tricks." He gathered his reins. "The cattle business will rebuild. It always does. And when it does, I'll still be here buying up the failures. You got lucky once. You won't get lucky twice." He rode away. Some men, Gunnarsson thought, would rather be right than alive. Reeves was one of them. He would spend the rest of his life insisting the tunnel was a fluke. The survival was coincidence. The physics were fantasy. He would never build one. He would never admit he'd been wrong. And that was his choice to make. The harvest gathering came in September. The first since the disaster winter. The first time the scattered homesteaders of the region came together since they'd buried their dead and counted their losses. It was held at Roundup in the open space behind Anna Lindqvist's store. 50 people, maybe more, gathered around long tables of food and drink, their conversations mixing in the cool autumn air. Gunnarsson hadn't planned to attend. He had work to do, always work to do, and the memory of being excluded from last year's Christmas gathering still lingered. But Higgins had insisted. "They want to hear from you," Higgins said. "They need to hear from you. Half the people here lost family this winter. The other half came close. They need to know it doesn't have to happen again." So Gunnarsson went. And when the time came, he stood up in front of the assembled crowd and spoke. He kept it simple. The tunnel dimensions, the depth below frost line, the principle of convection warm air rising, cool air sinking, the heat output of cattle, 3,500 British thermal units per hour per cow. 4 cows equaling 1 wood stove. The system requiring no fuel except hay the cattle would eat anyway. He spoke for 15 minutes, then he answered questions. "Does it work with horses?" Horses produce similar heat, should work the same. What about sheep? More sheep needed smaller animals, less heat per head, but the principle holds. Can you build one into a sod house? Harder, but the crawl space design could adapt. How deep does the tunnel need to be in Nebraska? Frost line there is shallower. 3 feet might be enough. The questions continued for an hour. When they finally wound down, 15 families had committed to building systems before the next winter. 3 ranchers were planning larger-scale installations. One man from the Territorial Agricultural Society was taking notes for a report to the commissioner. It wasn't a revolution, but seeds had been planted. Elias Gunnarsson proved up his homestead claim in 1891, 5 years and 2 months after he'd filed the original paperwork in Miles City. By then, the cabin had been expanded twice, a bedroom addition in 88, a full kitchen in 90. The tunnel had been reinforced with stone walls, the wooden shoring replaced with something more permanent. He married in 1889, Ingrid Bjornsson, a Swedish immigrant he'd met at Anna Lindqvist's store. They had 4 children between 1890 and 1896, 3 daughters and a son, all raised in a cabin that never needed more than 2 cords of firewood per winter. The cattle herd grew slowly, 8 head by 90, 12 by 95. Each addition meant more heat, meant the system worked better, meant the winters became more comfortable rather than less. Other homesteaders adopted variations. By 1895, perhaps 30 or 40 claims across eastern Montana used some version of the tunnel system direct connections, root cellar modifications, house barn designs borrowed from the old country. The regional name for it varied: Norwegian heating, cow tunnels, the Gunnarsson method among those who knew the origin. It never spread beyond that. The reasons were practical. Coal became available via the expanding railroad. Timber grew more accessible as settlements multiplied. Larger agricultural operations made small homesteads obsolete. The system solved a specific problem, heating without fuel in treeless country. And when that problem faded, the solution faded with it. By the 1920s, few practitioners remained. The tunnels collapsed, filled with dirt, were built over or forgotten. The knowledge passed down in families, mentioned in letters, recorded in the newsletters of immigrant societies, but never published in mainstream agricultural journals, never taught in the land-grant colleges, never standardized into common practice. The method that had saved Elias Gunnarsson, that had saved Samuel Higgins and his daughter Sarah, that had offered an alternative to the thousands who froze in the winter of 86 to 87, that method became invisible, not because it failed, but because it succeeded so quietly that no one thought to remember it. Sarah Higgins lived. She grew up on her father's rebuilt homestead, married a rancher's son in 1903, and raised 5 children of her own in a house with central heating and electric lights. The world she knew bore little resemblance to the one she'd nearly died in at 7 years old, but she remembered. She told her children about the winter of 87, about the cabin that stayed warm without a fire, about the Norwegian neighbor who had carried her through the blizzard, not literally, that had been her father, but who had built the place that saved her life. Her children told their children. The story became family legend, passed down through generations, simplified and embellished and occasionally doubted. A tunnel from a barn to a cabin, heated by cows? That couldn't be right. But it was right. And somewhere in the attics and archives of Sarah's descendants, a letter still exists. A copy of the one Gunnarsson sent to the Minneapolis Immigrant Society in 1887. Tunnel dimensions, construction timeline, temperature records, proof that it happened. Proof that it worked. In 1982, An engineer named Brian Ramlow developed a system he called cow power, a heat pump that extracted warmth from dairy barn air and transferred it to a farmhouse. A single cow, his calculations showed, produced 3,500 to 4,000 British thermal units per hour. 15 cows could heat a standard 2,000 square foot home. The technology was more sophisticated than Gunnarson's tunnel. It used compressors and freon and copper piping, but the principle was identical. The cattle are the fire. The warmth is already there. You just have to move it. Ramlow received some attention, a few customers, a modest success. He never knew that a Norwegian homesteader had proved the same concept 95 years earlier, using nothing but a shovel and a crawl space and the desperate mathematics of survival. Some ideas are born, forgotten, and born again. Some solutions wait in the earth for someone to need them badly enough to dig. The Gunnarsson homestead cabin was demolished in 1932. The land had passed through 3 owners by then. The original family scattered. Across the country, the tunnel long since collapsed and forgotten. The new owner wanted a modern house, and the old log structure stood in the way. But the foundation stones remained. The crawl space walls, built to last. And beneath the surface, the faint outline of a tunnel 60 feet of packed earth, running from where the barn had stood to where the cabin had stood, traceable if you knew where to look. In 2019, a graduate student in agricultural history ran ground-penetrating radar across the site as part of a research project on frontier settlement patterns. The scan showed an anomaly, a linear void, partially collapsed, running between 2 structural footprints. She dug a test trench, found timber remnants, took samples. The wood dated to 1886. The construction matched descriptions in a letter she'd found in the archives of the Scandinavian American Historical Society. A letter from a homesteader named Elias Gunnarsson, describing a tunnel system for transferring livestock heat to a cabin. She wrote her dissertation on frontier heating innovations. Chapter 4 covered the Gunnarsson method, 12 pages, including diagrams reconstructed from the original letter. 12 pages for 60 feet of tunnel and 4 cows and 1 stubborn immigrant who remembered what his grandfather knew. The American frontier demanded adaptation. The land did not negotiate. The weather did not compromise. The distances did not shrink for anyone's convenience. Survival went to those who could see what was available and imagine what was possible. Elias Gunnarsson saw 4 cows and 60 feet of frozen ground and imagined warmth. He dug for 3 weeks while his neighbors shook their heads. He gambled everything on a principle his grandfather had taught him before he understood what it meant. He was right. But being right wasn't the point. The point was Sarah Higgins opening her eyes after 3 days of fever, asking where she was, hearing the answer, safe. The point was Samuel Higgins standing in a warm cabin during the worst blizzard in Montana history, realizing that everything he believed about survival had been incomplete. The point was Anna Lindqvist stocking tunnel specifications in her general store, offering them at cost to anyone willing to try. The point was that it worked, not perfectly, not forever, not for everyone, but for one homestead, one winter, one 7-year-old girl who might have died in the cold. It worked. February 9th, 1887, 47 degrees below zero, wind at 50 miles an hour, the worst night of the worst winter in recorded Montana history. Inside a cabin heated by 4 cows and 60 feet of tunnel, a child's fever broke. Her father wept with relief. The Norwegian neighbor who had built the impossible system stood in the corner, watching, saying nothing. The floor radiated warmth from below. The wind screamed overhead. And somewhere out in the white darkness, the territory was dying, cattle by the thousands, settlers by the dozens, an entire way of life freezing solid and waiting for the spring thaw to reveal its corpse. But not here, not in this cabin, not tonight. 60 feet of tunnel, 4 cows, one stubborn immigrant who remembered how his grandfather stayed warm. Sometimes that's all it takes.